Republicans are pushing a series of new voting rules across the country that aim at restricting access to American voters. The raft of proposals come after the 2020 election was met with record voter turnout and, in turn, handed the presidency and Senate to Democrats. So CBS News first reported on the legislative efforts last month, and since then, more than 100 additional bills have been introduced aimed at clamping down on policies that help drive the historic turnout. So for more on this, we want to bring in Caitlin Huey-Burns. She's a CBSN political reporter, and Adam Brewster. He is a reporter covering special elections and midterms for CBS News. Thank you so much, guys, for joining us. So a lot of this stuff has to do with the last election and how the vote was attained. You know, there were record mail-in ballots, early voting, because we were dealing with a pandemic and we did not want a crush of people piled on top of each other voting and perhaps spreading this virus. So there's a very good reason that a lot of the guidelines were, I don't want to say loosened, but changed so that more people could vote and vote safely. Caitlin, where exactly are we seeing kind of a rolling back of this stuff happening in the U.S., and what are Republican lawmakers pushing for?
Good morning. There are over 250 bills in 43 states addressing these election laws, trying to change them. But the state that we have focused on for this piece is Georgia, because this week lawmakers there and the Republican-led legislature introduced a measure that, if passed, would amount to some of the most restrictive voting measures in the country. It would make it very difficult for people to vote by mail. The proposals would eliminate most mail-in voting for most people, and it would also require you to hand in or show some form of identification with your mail-in ballot in addition to a witness signature. What's interesting about Georgia, however, is that what we saw in the November election is over 5 million people turned out to vote and over 1 million people voted by mail. So it was a popular program and an expanded access to the vote. But Georgia has had mail-in voting in place for years. It passed the state legislature, the Republican state legislature, in 2005. So it's been in place for a long time. But lawmakers in the state are reacting to the losses that they saw at the presidential level and, of course, in those two key Senate races. There were also some proposals to eliminate early voting on Sundays, which would have disenfranchised black voters who use Sundays to encourage congregations to go to the polls. Souls to the Polls is a popular program. That has since been amended, and it's pretty unlikely that that will actually pass, although it could still be in place in some areas. So it's significant because Georgia is one of those states that former President Trump lost, and Republicans lost 2 key seats, and you're seeing the reaction among lawmakers in the state.
So former President Trump and his allies have lost more than 60 court cases related to allegations of voter fraud. We all know that. But Adam, what are the Republicans' justification for trying to implement these limiting and exclusive rules? Some of these proposed election laws are being introduced in states where the GOP won the presidential race.
One of those states that passed a bill last night and is headed to the governor's desk is in Iowa. That state President Trump did very well, and Republicans did well around the state. Democrats had hopes of maybe getting some control in the legislature, and they had big losses in the legislature there. Republicans have a large majority there. They lost a couple of congressional seats, the Democrats did. So it was a state where Republicans did very well. And what you've heard from some of the leaders who introduced this bill is, this is about making it harder to vote, or easier to vote and harder to cheat. That is kind of the refrain that you hear a lot from these Republicans across state lines, and a similar refrain that you've heard from one of the Republicans pushing a bill in Georgia who said this is about trying to restore confidence in the election system. Polling from late January from Quinnipiac found about 2/3 of Republicans didn't view President Biden's victory in November as legitimate. A Morning Consult poll from around the same time frame showed about 1/3 of Republicans didn't have trust in the election. So Republicans say this is about boosting confidence and increasing security while still allowing people access to voting. Now, one of the Republican senators in Iowa, speaking during a debate about the bill on the floor, did say, there's many people in my caucus, the Republican caucus, who believe the election was stolen. So we did see that sort of narrative rear its head in the debate in Iowa. But a lot of what you're seeing is that this is about election security, and even in states like Florida, another state that was successful, a state where President Trump won and where the election was very smooth, the governor there, Ron DeSantis, has said this isn't about sitting back and sort of resting on our laurels. It's about continuing to stay vigilant and making sure that the elections are secure.
Caitlin, are there any Republicans that are against these proposals? I mean, more people voting could mean more Republicans voting as well.
Right, and that was the argument made to me by Georgia's Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan. He said that he is against eliminating no excuse mail-in voting. He says, look, that would be a bad thing for Georgia if we got rid of that, because that means that, first of all, it would serve as kind of a knee-jerk reaction to the results of 2020, and they don't want to appear like that they're reacting specifically to that. And he also said, look, we need to go out and win every vote. And so the more expansive the access is to voting, Republicans could take advantage of that. And so he was very concerned that what's going on in his state with trying to eliminate mail-in voting and in some of these other states is very reactionary. And he also said it's something of a mirage. He said that, Republican-based voters have been, told, and through the rhetoric and the disinformation campaigns, that this was a rigged election, which just wasn't true. And so he said that there needs to be an effort among leaders, especially in the Republican Party, to say, look, we got beat, here's what we can do about it, and try to expand the vote. Now, there is a question of how much power he could actually have in preventing some of these measures, and he is still very supportive of those stricter voter ID laws. And so that's something that we've seen to come to be very popular, not only among the Georgia Republican lawmakers, but also kind of nationally, this push for stricter ID laws. So that might be where they are trying to put their focus and get people away from eliminating mail-in voting, which had become popular and showed access to the vote in the 2020 election.
So, Adam, the Republican National Committee recently announced that it's forming a new committee on election integrity. One thing I've never been clear on, and no one's ever been able to explain to me fully, is the Republicans gained seats in the 2020 election. And you don't often hear Republicans in the states that former President Trump lost, but where Republicans made gains in the House, saying, well, throw the whole thing out. Everything was focused around President Trump and not with the Republicans in districts that won their elections. And let's remind people, if you're watching CBSN from outside of this country, that when you vote in the United States of America, it's one ballot for everybody, right? And so no one's been able to explain to me, you're worried about election integrity, but not for my race, which I won, only for the race that affected control of the executive branch.
And that's something you've heard from Democrats in these states when there have been debates about the bills, saying, I haven't heard any of my colleagues here say that they were illegitimately elected, that everything dealt with the presidential level. And so you have heard Democrats throw that in, and you've heard, some Republicans who have pushed back against these claims of election fraud throw that in and say, look, I haven't heard from any of you guys saying that you shouldn't be sitting here trying to put things into law as well. But to get back to what the Republican National Committee is looking at doing, it's a committee on election integrity. Of course, the RNC, they cannot draft and pass laws, but they can certainly wield their power and push states and put suggestions out there that they would like to see states push for. I spoke to Joe Gruters, who's the chair of the Republican Party in Florida. He's a state senator down there as well. And, he said that one of the things that they're looking at is, states strengthening some of their ID requirements, whether that's, providing a driver's license or ID number, like something that they're looking at doing in Georgia. That's one of the proposals that's been put out there. RNC Chair Ronna McDaniel, when she was reelected last month, said, we're going to be focused on election integrity. Strong voter ID laws is something we want to see. So we've heard that come from her. One other thing Gruters talked about when I spoke with him is getting states to process their absentee ballots earlier. I think we talked about that a lot leading up to the election, especially in the upper Midwest, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, states that had no or very limited time frame to process ballots. took longer to process those ballots. There were results that were finished tabulating in the middle of the night. That, of course, fueled a lot of the conspiracy theories about where these votes were coming from. And Grutter said, when you wait until Election Day to start counting the votes, of course you're not going to have results on Election Day. So we would like to see these states push. And that will be interesting because that may put some Republicans over the top to change some of those laws in those states where Republicans control the legislature and Democrats control the governor's mansion. In Michigan, for example, the leaders of the legislature from the last session both said after the election that it was a mistake to not allow more time to process absentee ballots before the election. So that's another trend to keep an eye on. It doesn't necessarily deal with ballot access, but deals with the election process.
So, Caitlin, I imagine there are voting rights groups that are fighting these efforts. What's going on with that? And what about sort of federal lawmakers? Is there anything that can be done at that level?
Right. Well, in Georgia, Fair Fight, which is a group started by Stacey Abrams, is going to be launching an ad campaign going against these measures specifically in Georgia. But at the national level, something to keep an eye on is whether this encourages the push to pass the John Lewis Civil Rights Act. This was something that was talked about a lot in the special elections for the Senate in Georgia. Now Senator Warnock and now Senator Ossoff had been talking about the need to push for this new Civil Rights Act. And a key component of that would address something that the Supreme Court gutted several years ago, which was, it used to be that states with a history of discrimination had to get approval from the federal government to change voting laws. The Supreme Court got away with that, or did away with that provision in a decision several years ago, and that's something that activists say is really, needs to be restored, and especially now that you're seeing this push at the state legislative level when it comes to voting access. So watch in the Senate, especially if this does renew that push to get that bill passed, and if these Democratic lawmakers are going to start putting pressure on the Biden administration to either take executive action or to push from the administrative level as well. They said they need to kind of get through COVID relief, but this could be kind of the next big issue that some of these lawmakers want to see.
Let me ask you about the Conservative Political Action Conference, CPAC, which is set to get underway today. Yesterday, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy and Representative Liz Cheney had a bit of an awkward moment when they were both asked about the role of former President Trump in the future of the Republican Party and if he should speak at the conference. Let's play what they had to say.
Do you believe President Trump should be speaking, or former President Trump should be speaking at CPAC this weekend?
Yes, he should.
Congresswoman Cheney?
That's up to CPAC. I've been clear in my views about President Trump and the extent to which following January 6th, I don't believe that he should be playing a role in the future of the party or the country.
On that high note, thank you all very much.
Awkward. So, Caitlin, what does this say? What does this exchange say about the current state of the GOP? In my mind, you're sort of seeing it full-blown in your face that that's where they are. I mean, you've got one wing of the party that is looking to, move on and to get back to the things that that they champion for most of their lives, people like Liz Cheney. And then you've got other people who are still firmly planted in the Trumpist wing of the party. And it's not clear who's going to win.
Right. To the extent that there's a civil war brewing in the GOP, that video alone kind of shows it in a nutshell. And you saw kind of the sigh from Kevin McCarthy. And I don't know if you could see, but Steve Scalise also does a little bit of a sigh and kind of an eye roll when they go to Liz Cheney. We always try to see how we could be flies on the wall in some of these backroom conversations that they're having. And that was just wide out in the open and really shows that there is this divide on whether and how to embrace Trump or whether they need to move on. Liz Cheney, of course, has been in the latter camp. She was one of 10 lawmakers in the House, Republican lawmakers in the House, who voted to impeach him. Remember, she came at risk of losing her leadership position. There was backlash among those in her conference. She ultimately was successful and hasn't backed away from that stance. And that's what was remarkable about that, is that she is continuing to push that message. And Kevin McCarthy has been trying to kind of bring the two factions together, at least have them in something of a livable, let's get through this moment, because he wants the party to be united in opposition to the Biden administration, especially heading into the midterms. So we'll see, but that was a real time illustration of the challenges for this party right now.
All right, Caitlin Huey-Burns, Adam Brewster, thank you guys very much. Appreciate it.